I'd like to welcome everybody to this month's PastorCast. The PastorCast is a monthly program recorded live each month, designed for pastors and church leaders. We work to bring topics to the church that maybe are not to do with scripture and Sunday school class and programs, but really dealing with the business things that come around the church. Last month, we talked about church construction trends and had a great discussion with Tim Cool and a pastor from Life Fellowship here in Allen, Texas, talking about construction trends. And that was a great time together. And if you didn't get that, you can get that at thepastorcast.com. But this month, we are going to be talking about RLUIPA. RLUIPA is a law that affects the church, and specific if you are a church and have a zoning issue or looking to build on a piece of land, or maybe you're even in a temporary space and a city government tries to keep you out. RLUIPA is a law that was passed in 2000 by our Congress, by both Senate and House of Representatives unanimously. And so we're going to chat about that a little bit today. Today with me on the PastorCast, I have Dimitt and Mike Knapek from Jackson Walker here in Dallas, Texas. They serve as attorneys there, and they've been involved with RLUIPA decisions. They've worked with, if you've listened to the PastorCast in the past, you know that Liberty Institute has been on here talking about this topic in the past, and the guys there at Jackson Walker have worked with them on some of these cases in the past. So, Stephen, Mike, I want to welcome you today, and thank you for joining us.
Sean, thanks so much for having us today. Just kind of want to give you a little bit of insight of what we've seen and dealt with RLUIPA, and maybe have the churches have an idea after this of what to things to look at, what cities may be doing that may be a violation of RLUIPA, and really kind of what to watch out for.
Sure. Well, why don't you start off and, I say RLUIPA and people start, well, what are we talking about here? So give me a quick recap. What is RLUIPA? Just for the lay person, let's make it as simple as possible. Sure.
RLUIPA, the long name is the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, also known as RLUIPA or RLUIPA, as you said. One of those passed in 2000 under President Clinton. It's one of those rare times where it was a unanimous vote by both the House and Senate. And today being an election day, and as divisive as the country can be, I think it's really telling of how important this statute is to have everybody come together to really support religious liberties and support the church's growth moving forward. But just a brief background, like you said, it deals with whenever a municipality, a town or city is placing a land use regulation that will have an impact on somebody's religious exercise. And typically we can go through some scenarios, but a lot of times it's either a church wants to grow and expand, or they're already performing an act in a specific zoning classification, and the city wants to prohibit them from either expanding or continuing their religious exercise. That's and really what I think it comes down to is this was enacted in response to some investigation that was done about cities really and local governments excluding houses of worship and trying to prevent that from happening. As you know, the real reason it seems like the focus for cities is that churches are tax exempt and they're losing a large tax base. Now, also in some parts of the country, they may have a specific kind of maybe discrimination against a specific religion as well.
Sure. Well, in our working with churches around their needs in real estate, we discuss zoning. This is part of our everyday job, and understanding what the zoning is of a piece of property. Understanding the zoning is key, but the city cannot restrict you from using that property as a church because of its zoning laws. There can be certain requirements for different zonings, like in the city of Plano, for example, where I'm sitting right now, church is allowed in every zoning category by right. In some cities, in residential areas, they might make you submit for a special use permit That doesn't mean they're keeping you out of there, but they're going to ask you to go through some things just like they would a private school, a daycare, different uses that are special use for example, in a residential area. They would make you go through a special use permit. So sometimes we start talking with churches about zoning and maybe there's some questions there. And this is why we try to work very closely and understand what each city's zoning laws are. But the good news with RLUIPA is that the city cannot restrict you based on their zoning restrictions. How does that affect a church? Maybe you can use an example of a case you guys have worked on where a church has been worshiping in a space and then the city tried to restrict them. Can we chat maybe about an example there?
Sure. There comes down with RLUIPA, there are really 4 or 5 on the legal side would cause a cause of action of a way to attack what the city is doing. And we'll go through those in more detail later on, but to address your question, for example, say a church finds a great piece of property, and nowadays we've gone from the traditional, steeple church in a residential area to maybe reconfiguring a warehouse or an industrial district. And so what may not be traditional is now today a terrific location for a church or maybe a satellite church from a larger church. So, on its face, the church may look out and say, this warehouse or this office is a great location to be in. Unfortunately, it's located in an industrial district, and the city does not allow churches in that industrial district. And we're dealing with a similar case right now in Nebraska, where that might be okay. In the cities, they're allowed to enforce their zoning to an extent. And so in that case, while they may not allow a church there, they're not allowed to preclude a church, but then allow all other non-religious assemblies, such as fraternal, civic, and social organizations from going into that industrial area. That's going to violate what's called the equal terms provision of RLUIPA. So you can't really exclude a church and prevent and allow every other type of non-religious use to come in. That's something on its face violates it. And so whenever a church maybe is looking out for this perfect piece of property, and initially they say, well, we're not allowed there, sometimes you need to dig deeper and see, well, maybe we're not allowed there, but is that legal? Does that violate RLUIPA? And that's something we really want to dig into and see.
Sure. So I can think, on piggyback on that, I had a church that wanted to be in the middle of a retail development. And so they approached the city, and the city said, hey, well, that is not a part of this zoning category. But they did allow us to submit for rezoning if we chose to. And the kind of feather in our cap was we knew that if they kept us out of there for some reason other than public safety, that we did have our RLUIPA on our side. Turned out that the church decided not to go through the zoning case because it was going to be $20,000 or $30,000. And then with the things we needed to do to get that zoning case approved, because the city was not going to support that rezoning.
Right.
And rezoning is, you got to go through public hearings, planning and zoning, city council. And that church made the decision to turn away from that. Now, if that was the only piece of property in town they could have been on, that would have been something we could have done, because I do not believe, with what my understanding of RLUIPA, that the city could have kept us out of that property unless they could have proven that we provided some sort of harm to that development.
That's right. That's really what we've seen going forward is the city is banking on the church saying we don't want to pay, it's too expensive to get in there, or we don't want to have to fight with the city, a place we're trying to get into and really worship and be a part of the community. So they're banking on the church going someplace else and not having to fight. Sure.
Maybe Mike or Stephen, whoever wants to address this, will you differentiate between city zoning and then covenants or restrictions that a developer might place on a retail development, for example?
Yeah, John, this is Mike. City zoning is the city ordinance that's approved by the city council that sets out different types of uses for different areas in the city. Whereas a restrictive covenant is a contract. It's interpreted by the courts as a contract that the developer has with each property owner. For example, You'll see sometimes in a subdivision a restrictive covenant that does not allow for two-story homes in the residential area. And courts interpret that along the same lines as a normal contract case. I question whether or not if the zoning ordinances of a city would otherwise allow a church. I question whether or not a developer could impose a restrictive covenant on property that would not allow for a church. And I mean, you certainly cannot discriminate between religions. For example, if a developer came in and wanted to say a particular religion could not operate as a church in an area but others could, that's obviously illegal. So if the covenant itself is illegal, courts are not going to enforce them.
Right.
So,
well, my experience has been with RLUIPA protecting a church from a city government, a governing municipality, from keeping them out of a development. Whereas I come across this all the time, where a church wants to go in an old grocery store. Well, that developer, when he built that development, that retail development, in order to entice tenants or maybe a large anchor tenant, sometimes they put the covenant in that says everything in here will be income producing properties or
right.
like users. And so sometimes we are kept out of development by a private owner of a property. And I think it's a separate discussion when it's a private owner developer of a property versus a governing municipality. And that's where I've seen RLUIPA has been so great, because there have been cities. I think there was one in New York not too long ago where they wanted to keep a church out of a property, and the church, I think they were a tenant at the time, and they were able to claim, hey, RLUIPA, we have protection here. And so that's my experience, how I've seen it. We've seen some churches here locally that have had to use this statute themselves to be able to use their property. So I guess, you don't have any other cases or examples maybe that, I know we mentioned the one in Nebraska, but maybe is there any other examples where a church has really been significantly helped by RLUIPA?
Sure, definitely. There's lots of examples throughout the country. And the good thing here is, RLUIPA is a federal statute. So while we're based in Texas, we can practice that and kind of go after cities and municipalities throughout the country, enforcing the churches or religious institutions' rights really anywhere. So another example, another test for RLUIPA is what's called a substantial burden. And so this is the case where a city or municipality is not allowed to substantially burden the exercise of religion unless they're really, like you said, furthering a compelling governmental interest for public safety or welfare or something along those lines, by the least restrictive means. And so a lot of people, as churches are well aware, they're used to the zoning context. And really this comes up, and keep your eyes out when things start to get derailed, where I've never dealt with this before. I'm going through a lot more of undue delay, a lot more burdensome than maybe in some other cities. And really, what's the underlying factor here? Is this a normal course, or is the city putting more roadblocks in the church as a way to prevent them? And so a case that was going on up in New York also, where the municipality was trying to require the church to pay for a fire truck for the city, since they didn't pay taxes, as saying, hey, we'll approve your zoning, you pay for the fire truck for the city, and had other restrictions as well. Luckily, the Second Circuit came down and said that violates RLUIPA. You can't put those type of conditions on the church to force their hand to pay taxes or another reason to get in front of the city. So that's another example. And really, RLUIPA is a great way to protect, your mega church or your small, even kind of a home group, from being able to exercise their religious freedoms throughout the country. So it's really, we've seen, throughout dealing with another case up in New York where they're trying to restrict weddings, banquets, and funerals from the church having that, which, as we all know, is fundamental religious exercise. And luckily working through that to help get those removed and allow the church to continue to practice its religion the way it should be able to.
Yeah, John, we've got a case in New York that where the town is trying to tell the church, or has imposed conditions on a site plan approval to the church, saying you can only have 3 church services on Sundays, and you cannot have any church services on during the week before 6:30. And we are currently on behalf of the church fighting that, contending that among other things, that the town is treating other uses that are non-religious uses. You don't limit their operations during specific hours. For example, I think this property is in an office and residential area, and there's no restrictions on the operations of offices that we know of that the town has imposed on non-religious uses, and we're continuing. That's discriminating against the church, and that's treating the church unequal, or I guess the unequal terms provision is what we're also asserting in that case. So it's but to your point that you made earlier, we're finding more and more that churches in the past at least have said, but I don't want to fool with this. I don't want to spend the money. But one great thing about RLUIPA is that you get if you're successful, the court can award the church its attorney's fees. And so that's always out there for the church to be able to have the opportunity to recover its fees if it's incurred.
Yeah, I would never want a church to not pursue this because of dollars. Because as I work with churches, there's lots of churches, especially small church plants, who maybe do not have a lot of discretionary funds. So the fact that you could get those brought back to you, or again, our friends at the Liberty Institute have fought the cases for churches who didn't have the means up front on the front side of it. And I know you guys have been involved in those. I would never want a church to not be able to, know their rights and actually be able to worship. This law was even extended. The reason there's an IP in RLUIPA, it's RLUIPA. It was to allow institutionalized persons, prisoners, to worship as they please. And so this went from the jailhouse to the church house. And, also this is coming up a lot of times where a church is leasing a space in a commercial development, or they're building a brand new property in a commercial or residential development. And that's where a lot of these zoning questions, at least the ones I've seen, have come up. And maybe like your opinion, because obviously today is election day and there's a lot of concern about religious freedom in our country. And I was going to ask you guys, just for your perspective of, is RLUIPA in danger of going away? Is this something, obviously it was passed unanimously by the House and Senate, which that would be a miracle if we could get something like that done today. What does the church need to be thinking about as related to this? Is this something that is being fought and won repeatedly, and we feel, hey, this is a pretty good statute for us? Or do you have an opinion on that?
Sure. First part of your question, no, I don't think that this is in jeopardy of going away. On the legal side, even though it was enacted in 2000, it's still, in our world, a relatively new statute, and courts are really still figuring out the test and the framework of how to address this, to balance the both sides' interest, to find kind of the best solution. Some courts are more deferential to churches, and some are cities, and it hasn't gone back up to the United States Supreme Court. It's really the lower circuit court levels, but really we're kind of figuring out what this law is going to be. Right now, it's a great tool for churches and religious institutions. That one of those, they definitely need to know their rights, know what they're allowed to do. And like you said before, to kind of backtrack, I don't want ever a church not to pursue property that's going to be the best for their congregation because of a monetary issue. At a minimum, I think it's worth have an attorney or somebody send a demand letter to the municipality and really educate them on what RLUIPA is, because a lot of even small towns, they're not as familiar with this. They don't probably deal with this issue often. And so maybe they violate the statute, not on purpose, but because they really don't know the law. So it's an education process that at a minimum, the church should reach out and try to make the city aware of RLUIPA.
Stephen, that is
and John, another thing that we have found in our representing churches is that we are in pretty regular routine contact with the United States Department of Justice. And the United States Department of Justice has a civil rights division that focuses on RLUIPA. And they are interested in two cases that we currently have pending. And have gone so far in one case to recently send a notice that the Department of Justice is investigating the land use practices of a particular municipality that's in question. So, and I wouldn't think you'd want the Department of Justice knocking on your door any more than you would want 60 Minutes knocking on your door.
No.
So we'll see where that goes. But and they're not interested in every matter, but they seem to have gotten interested in a couple of things that we're working on. So
sure. Well, let me just respond to two things you said, Stephen. First of all, I think a lot of times the cases I've seen has been almost a thing of going back and asking for forgiveness instead of permission. Churches that didn't know that they were even out of the zoning, maybe they signed a purchase agreement or a lease on a space, and they did not know that what the city's zoning rules were, their zoning ordinance, and it came as a surprise, and it got in the way of their plans. And it was it was too late, and now they were in the middle of a disagreement and maybe a lawsuit. If churches are pursuing property, that's one of the first things we do to help count the cost of looking at the options, understanding the zoning, and when we do need to do a rezoning, or maybe there is a statute in the city zoning, we go handle it with them up front early and let them know that, hey, this is what we're trying to do. We need a special use permit. We need you to support this. And if we get that pushback early on, we can cite RLUIPA. We could bring you guys along with us to a meeting to say, city, you can't do this. And let's have this discussion earlier in the process to hopefully avoid some situation where maybe a church has already moved in and now the city is trying to stop them. So I think if we can count that, consider that early in the process, I think that will save churches a lot of time and headache. And then Mike, in response to what you're talking about, we had a city here in Collin County that was the most restrictive city on their zoning ordinance towards churches. And it was really neat about 5 years ago to see all the churches in that city, and it wasn't just Christian churches, it was all the religious institutions came together and requested the city council rewrite their zoning ordinance, or the city rewrite their zoning ordinance to not be burdensome. And they were successful. There was probably, before that action of all those churches and pastors coming together, there was probably 6 to 8 zoning categories that flat out did not allow a church. And that got changed. And then many of them you had to do a special use permit, so there wasn't very many by right. And that got changed because the pastors and the churches, religious organizations in that city came together and had an open discussion with the city leaders. And that zoning ordinance did change. So both of you commented on those, and those were thoughts I had as I heard you talk about that. The church can be proactive in this discussion.
Well, I mean, I think that's, John, it's Mike. I mean, as long as the city is willing to be open about it and cooperative, that's great. I mean, we run into situations where city representatives are not so open and not so cooperative, and pretty much tell you that we're going to run our city like we want to. we've been doing it this way for 200 years, and we're going to do it for another 200 years. So,
well, and that's
sometimes
when you come with you guys with them to say, no, city, this is our right. We know that, and either you start to work with us, or we will see you in court.
Well, and sometimes you got big money standing behind the city as well. I mean, you got businesses in the area who don't want a church, who have a lot of persuasion and influence on the city leaders, and that's when you start digging in in discovery to try to find communications between the city and those influential people or companies, that you try to find some motive on the part of the city other than just being hard-headed about it.
Sure. Before we close down, is there any other maybe examples or cases we didn't discuss that you think we ought to bring to churches' attention, or maybe a best practice for if they do think that maybe they have a city that is treating them wrong? What would be your recommendation for best steps for pastor or church leader to start this ball rolling as far as you're concerned?
Like you said, I think definitely start off with a proactive approach. And the delicate situation here is a lot of the churches are getting in, they're moving in either to a new church or expanding, and they're there really to reach out to the community, to really be a part of it. And so they might be reluctant at first of not to go in there guns blazing, we want to file a lawsuit, but I don't think it starts off with that. I think it starts off with an open and honest dialogue with the city. And like you said, the one case in Collin County, hopefully they're receptive and they realize, okay, this is not what the statute allows. We're allowed to be in that certain location or expand our church. And then if they're not, you step go forward a little bit, and whether you contact us or an attorney to really educate them on the process and push forward. But sometimes you have to go forward, and it's one of those where there is an underlying motive, like Mike said, of why are they not allowing you in. So I think first is just keying in on, if you're familiar with the zoning process, you're looking at cues and things that are unusual. So it's really very slow process, undue delays and cost. If you're not familiar with the process, sometimes it's the smell test. This just doesn't seem right. This seems like I'm getting a lot of pushback. They keep asking for different documents or studies or traffic studies that seem like they're not warranted. Next would be when they're excluding you from a certain zoning category, whether they completely exclude churches, whether they require a specific use permit or a conditional use permit, and they don't require other non-religious institutions. So it's really seeing, first, do things seem off? Second, am I being treated differently than others? And if I am, there might be an RLUIPA problem there. And that's the time of really to reach out and to have that dialogue with the city and see how far you need to go to really protect the church's rights.
Sure. Well, I didn't do my shameless plug at the beginning. The PastorCast is sponsored by Service Realty, and our team here of church real estate professionals is a good place to start if a church is looking at a land use thing, whether you're buying a piece of property, leasing it. Our team will start this conversation with the city. If you're in that situation, we'll start it early, and then we'll help connect you with guys like Stephen and Mike we are not lawyers. We are real estate brokers who help churches through this specific use of church properties. So we understand that, but we are not attorneys. We cannot do what Stephen and Mike can do for you when you need to go have that conversation or write that letter to a city government. So we can partner well together in that season. But we're going to go have this conversation up front. If you're buying a property, I think the biggest mistake I've seen churches make is they don't ask the zoning or permitting questions until after they've already purchased their property. These kind of discussions need to happen early in your process, before you buy something, before you sign a lease, so that you don't have surprises. And then guys like Stephen and Mike and their team there, when needed, can come in and you will know who the city planning director is. You'll know your city councilman, because we've oiled those wheels of starting those conversations earlier, and that will help us in the process. Stephen, you're exactly right. When you get into any kind of litigious thing with a city or anybody, it's going to slow down. It's going to not be as easy as you want it to be. It's not going to go according to your time schedule. And if the church has already moved in and told people they're meeting there, that's when it's most disruptive. So I would encourage church leaders listening to this, if you need a property or have an issue, confront it early, get the right people on your team. And I know Stephen and Mike, we're better for our time today understanding this. I think this is something not everybody knows about this law. And but I always tell people, hey, Bill Clinton did something good before he left office. And sorry if I let my colors show there, but this law that was passed, again, I just go back to unanimous consent and voice votes. Everybody agreed on this, and boy, I pray for our country that we will have more times where we can agree on things that will actually be something that this kept persecution away from the church. It's allowed prisoners in jail to worship as they please. And so that's just, I'm happy for this. Glad we were able to have this discussion today. Anything else you guys have before I wrap up and finish?
No, I don't think so, John. Thanks so much for letting us come on board, and can I share our thoughts on RLUIPA, and hopefully can help out some people in the future.
Yeah, John, thank you very much.
You're welcome. So we'll have this out. This is going to go out on Spreaker out of my Twitter account. I'll put some contact information in the show notes. And we're trying to get better and better with this podcast operation. So we appreciate all you do take the time to listen. And we'll look forward to talking to you next time.